The River Nile is the longest river in the world. Touching parts of 10 countries and draining approximately 10% of Africa's landmass, the River Nile Basin is an environment endowed with a variety of natural resources and rich cultural history.
The Nile environment is host to a spectacular range of ecosystems, from high mountains, tropical forests, woodlands and wetlands in the south to savannas and deserts in the north. It is also home to a great range of flora and fauna. Most importantly, it is home to 160 million people spread in 10 riparian countries who derive a livelihood from its resources.
In spite of its rich endowment, the Nile environment is host to some of the world's poorest nations. High poverty levels, compounded with rapid population growth in the member countries in recent years, has put enormous pressure on the natural resources and ecological systems of the Nile Basin. Adverse environmental threats continue to undermine the efforts of the Nile riparian countries to propagate sustainable economic development in the region. One of the development partners explains the nature and impact of these challenges.
Poverty and conflict in the Nile Basin is the single greatest threat to the environment. And there is no doubt this is an extremely fragile and vulnerable ecosystem. I described it as the longest river in the world and one of the most important rivers in the world, but there's not a lot of water in the river system. It's vulnerable to climate change, vulnerable to desertification, vulnerable to all sorts of degradation because of sedimentation. Even the natural loads are huge. So the threats are great.
Recognition of shared challenges that run across the Nile Basin states led to the joint search for basin-wide solutions through the formation of a multi-governmental organization, the Nile Basin Initiative. The initiative is cognizant of the strength and potential for success that is inherent in transboundary partnership and cooperation, as the executive director explains.
This region was a region of conflict, so you have to solve that by implementing transboundary project. It's an opportunity to allow people to work together. Then, of course, it's a way of conflict resolution, and this is also one of our objectives, to bring and promote peace in the region through actions on the ground. We also encourage people to implement cross-border projects. Then you can have a community from two countries working together to protect the environment.
Comme vous le savez très bien, l'eau c'est la vie. Sans l'eau, on ne peut pas vivre. Sans l'eau, l'environnement ne pourra pas exister. Alors pour les pays du Nil, ce don d'Isière est très important pour la vie de la population des 10 pays, mais aussi pour la faune et la flore qui sont les composantes de la vie, qui est d'une importance capitale pour nos peuples et pour les générations futures. Je dis que sans l'eau, on ne pourra pas développer des activités économiques, on ne pourra pas trouver à manger, ce qui dit que l'eau est primordiale pour la vie.
The Nile Basin Initiative share a vision where poverty is eradicated and the environment managed for the benefit of future generations. Action is taken at 2 levels. First, all countries come together in the Shared Vision project to build trust and skills. Second, smaller groups of countries come together in joint development projects targeting the very poor.
Partnership building across the Nile riparian states is therefore a key function of the NBI as it seeks solutions to the environmental challenges that face the member countries. Ministerial and technical advisory committees with membership from all member countries ensures that there are harmonious cross-border relations.
Harmonious environmental management across borders is also promoted in realization that some of the environmental threats in the basin occur at national level, but their environmental impacts are of a regional nature and spread beyond national borders.
An environmental analysis conducted in 1999 identified several transboundary environmental issues of the Nile Basin. Chief among these was land degradation, among others.
Rain-fed agriculture and livestock grazing are the most widespread forms of land use in the Nile Basin. They are associated with the most serious and accelerated environmental degradation in the basin.
One of the key causes is soil erosion, caused by clearing of vegetation cover and uncontrolled cultivation along the rivers and lake shores. This has led to increased surface runoff and excessive silting of lakes and rivers, which degrade the purity of the Nile Basin waters and fills dams. River and lakeshore cultivation is the most common in the Kagera Basin countries. Sudan and Egypt also experience this problem. Forest clearing for firewood, agriculture and building materials is experienced in most of the basin, but is most common in the Blue Nile Basin of western Ethiopia and northern Sudan. In these areas, 80% of the rural population depends on wood fuel.
In parts of the Kagera and Lake Victoria basins, forest clearing is mainly for commercial timber and charcoal business. This has laid a major stake on the forest resources. Loss of forest has been attributed to the extensive changes witnessed in the macroclimate of the region. Declining water levels in the lakes, reducing snows in the mountains, floods, droughts and irregular rainfall patterns are emerging ecological phenomena linked to climate change and destabilization of the ecological stability of the basin.
Mining also contributes to degradation of the agricultural lands as it requires clearing of vegetation. Some forms of mining use fuel wood, which contributes further to land degradation. Lack of rehabilitation of mining sites contributes further to environmental degradation. In the Ethiopian highlands currently, over 20,000 square kilometers of agricultural land have topsoils less than 10 centimeters deep, which cannot sustain agriculture. If the degradation trend goes on unchecked, soil degradation in the agricultural highlands in western Ethiopia and Sudan is expected to increase from the current 20,000 square kilometers to 100,000 square kilometers in 3 years' time.
This will intensify food insecurity in the region. For example, in Ethiopia, there has been 1.4% annual decline in per capita agricultural productivity over the last 20 years due to land degradation.
Another major threat to the Nile environment is loss of wetlands. Wetlands are among the most productive ecosystems in the world. Within the Nile Basin, they cover about 100,000 square kilometers, 1/3 of the entire basin. The greatest concentration of wetlands is within the equatorial lakes, especially in Uganda. The Sud in southern Sudan is one of the biggest wetlands in the world.
Apart from their critical contribution to maintaining river flows, wetlands also support livelihoods for a great number of people within the basin, consequently placing them under threat through draining, fragmentation, and conversion, leading to biodiversity loss. Population pressure, frequent droughts, lack of awareness, and sporadic rainfall patterns have resulted in settlement on the wetlands by peasant farmers and pastoralists.
Uncontrolled cultivation along the rivers and lake shores has led to increased surface runoff and excessive silting of lakes and rivers. The wetlands serve as the water storage reservoirs that feed and recharge the Nile. Large-scale agriculture has contributed to the extensive conversion of wetlands into agricultural lands, especially in Burundi and Kenya.
Loss of wetlands has also been caused by clay extraction for brick making. This is a common practice in almost all the riparian countries, but is most pronounced in Burundi and Rwanda. Brick making also encourages indiscriminate cutting down of trees for wood fuel, which is needed for burning the bricks. Loss of wetlands has far-reaching ecological effects. Lost with them is the wetlands ecosystem role of maintaining water quality, trapping sediments, buffering floods, and stabilizing the microclimates of particular regions.
Lost also is the unique animal and plant species that contribute to the rich biodiversity of the Nile Basin. In the Lake Victoria Basin, for instance, the fish species have been declining in the last 20 years due to changing ecological conditions. Population pressure, poverty, and lack of strict control and monitoring systems of human settlements are factors that have contributed to this state of affairs.
Water quality in the Nile Basin has been deteriorating in recent decades. Oil and chemical pollution has affected water quality across the national boundaries of the riparian states. Motor vehicle oil residues liberally mix with the lake waters in these car wash areas in Kenya and Uganda.
Other contributors to lower quality levels include toxic and hazardous mining wastes, agricultural runoff containing high loads of fertilizers and pesticides, industrial wastes, domestic effluents, and silting. Water quality, especially in the Upper Nile countries of Sudan and Egypt, is especially low due to the chemical, industrial, and domestic pollution the Nile waters encounter upstream.
These pollutants are to be found in virtually all countries of the Nile Basin. In urban centers, industrial waters and solid wastes are common. This kind of dumping is common in most Nile riparian urban centers. Kampala, Khartoum, and Cairo are hotspots. Concentrations of salts, organic matter, fecal material, heavy metals, and pesticides are high, especially upstream towards the Nile Delta in Sudan and Egypt. In Egypt, from Aswan to the Delta, the quality of the Nile water declines drastically.
Polluted waters result in widespread waterborne diseases. Basin-wide diarrhea is a major cause of death in children in the Nile Basin. Silting also contributes to degradation of the waters in the rivers and lakes of the Nile Basin and reduces the lifespan of dams and reservoirs. It has clogged irrigation canals and caused widespread flooding, human displacement, and suffering. While siltation is basin-wide, some hotspots include the watersheds of Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania.
Proliferation of invasive aquatic weeds is also a threat to both the quality of water and the biodiversity of the lake basin. Water hyacinth, that is most common in the Kagera and Lake Victoria basins, lakes in Burundi, Rwanda, DR Congo, Uganda, and Lake Victoria as a whole, has choked marine transport, obstructed waterways, dams, and hydropower generation facilities. It has adversely affected fishing in these water systems.
The invasive weeds have contributed to the suffocation or eutrophication of lakes and rivers, which have led to the decline in water quality due to lack of oxygen and decline in fish yields. Eutrophication is the biggest threat to the marine life in the Kagera and Lake Victoria basins and has a major impact on food security in the region.
Natural disasters like floods and droughts also contribute to the threats that the Nile Basin faces. Wet seasons in Ethiopia cause large-scale floods in the Sudan, displacing large numbers of people and causing damage to property. Droughts too cause major suffering, especially in the Ethiopian highlands and throughout semi-arid parts of the Nile Basin. Reduced and delayed rains and desertification has increased drought problems in the Sudan, while Ethiopia has experienced at least 14 droughts since 1965. Lack of flood and drought warning systems make mitigating efforts difficult to plan.
The 2000 volcanic eruption in North Kivu in DRC also had a major impact on the biodiversity of the region due to drying up of major watersheds. Political conflicts cause internal displacements and refugees impose pressure on local natural resources as they seek for food, water, shelter, and firewood. The pressure normally leads to environmental destruction, especially deforestation. Internal displacements and refugees are to be found in many parts of the Nile Basin, including DR Congo, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Rwanda, Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. These environmental threats present a challenge. The challenge of designing an analytical framework that can draw responsive basin-wide mitigating programs and activities.
To ensure that the future developments of the Nile Basin are environmentally sustainable,